This is the In Context podcast with your host, Karin von Hippel.
Hello, I'm Karin von Hippel, the director at RUSI, and we are launching In Context, our new podcast, where we interview very interesting people, hear a bit about their lives and their concerns. Today, we are delighted to welcome Chris Di Bona, who is the head of open source at Google. So, welcome Chris Di Bona to RUSI, and welcome to RUSI's inaugural podcast.
It's an honor to be here for the inaugural podcast.
Now, you are on the RUSI advisory board now for about a year and a half, but I actually have known you for at least a decade, if not longer.
Yeah.
And in fact, you've been at Google a lot longer than that even, right?
Well, not a lot longer. I'm hitting my 14th anniversary of my start date on the 2nd of August.
So you are one of the, we discussed this yesterday, you're one of the longest serving members at Google?
No. Well, so we have a funny tool at the company called epitaphs, which sounds grimmer than it really is. And percent is the other tool. And in it, you can see how many people started after you and how many started before you and the rest. And since my first day as a Noogler in 2004, I think something like 99.4% of the company started after me. So
okay,
there you go.
I repeat, you were one of the longest serving.
But there's plenty of people before me
employees at Google
who are still there. So.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because these days you see people coming and going so much at tech firms, right? And so it's a testament to something that you stay there that long.
Stubbornness,
enjoy the
run
work.
The security. Actually, so I do love the job. But yeah.
So tell us a bit. Your title is you're director of open source and science outreach, right? Tell us a bit. For those who don't know what open source really is, tell us a bit what that means.
Well, most people actually don't know what open source is, so that's hardly uncommon. So open source software, very simply, is a software under an open source license. And it is the foundational technology in almost every piece of software you use today. I'm sure you've heard of things like Linux, and all the programming languages that you might use when creating software, all are open source or free software. And that sort of software has obligations attached to it, whether it's to acknowledge that you're using it or to share code as well. And so my job is making sure that we meet those obligations. And also that when we release code from the company, that it's under an open source license that is usable by our partners, by developers and friends all over the world. So we've brought in an incredible amount of software into the company, and we've released an incredible amount.
What percentage would you say is not open source?
Oh, it's probably 1 for 1, not open source to open source. And it's funny, though, because when you look at how we release software from the company, it can be under any model you can imagine because we do so much. And so when you look at something like Android, for instance, the Android open source project is, I want to say, 700 different repositories spanning tens of millions of lines of code, which is a terrible measure, but it's one we have.
So, but in terms of open source, I mean, one of the interesting things for people who are interested in open source innovation, for example, is that they really believe everything should be out there because free revealing makes economic sense because you can build on other people's innovations, or lots of interesting theories about why everything should not be proprietorial, if that's the right word, why it should all be freely revealed online. What's your view on that?
So the desire to open everything up is one I completely understand. And there's a lot of places where I think that we have an obligation as a society to open software up. Like you'll see this within government-funded software development. But when it comes to everything must be open, it's like, sure, that would be a great world. But in my experience, you can actually open source an awful lot of software without having to open source everything. And there's often a lot of reticence to open source everything. So for instance, for a long time, people would say to me, people would never open source a database. And yet we had always had, databases that were open source, and they were very good and still are. Then they'd say, well, no one would ever open source this thing or that thing. And the reality is, I can find you an open source example of pretty much any proprietary project that's out there.
Interesting.
And some are extremely popular with their user bases, and some simply aren't. And people have chosen other proprietary options. So one place where you see almost all proprietary software is in entertainment and games and that sort of thing, because the nature of games and movies and the rest is that if they share too much too early, the suspense is gone, the drama is gone, right? And people have been proven to pay for this kind of thing. Similarly, if you look at like some of the more dense, complicated enterprise software that's out there, what you're really paying for is you're paying for someone to help you use it.
So what's an example of that? What's a dense software example?
Oil field management software is sort of a classic one. So what you saw with some of the oil companies, I think it was British Petroleum and ExxonMobil and Chevron, is they were spending a lot of money on managing oil fields and doing initial drilling and that sort of thing. So the way they compete is they compete on logistics, they compete on finding new sources of oil and on refining efficiencies. And so they don't compete on managing an oil field. And so they got together and they said, well, we're all spending literally billions on software over the years for managing all these oil fields and these pump jacks. So why don't we get together and save some money and just do it together in a consortium, right? And they ended up not open sourcing in that case, but doing it together in what a lot of people would think of as an open source way. And you've seen this where companies will come together in a given sphere to reduce their costs and compete better against maybe the leader in a given area.
Okay, that was your open source hat at Google.
Partly, yeah.
Part of it, yeah. It also says science outreach. Does that mean you go to high schools, to universities? Do you go to elementary schools? Do you just outreach to the public? What does that mean exactly?
So it's sort of a catch-all term. At Google, there's groups that are concentrating on reaching out to various different verticals and the rest. But inherently at Google, we sort of have a love of science. And I know that sounds like a little weird. And because I'm not actually talking about computer science in this case. I'm talking about physics. I'm talking about biology. I'm talking about the rest. But inherently, the science outreach job is it's almost an internal job at Google. So we operate, I think, 48 makerspaces inside the company.
I think you're going to have to explain what the maker movement is as well, because I'm not sure everyone knows that too.
So whether you call it tinkering or fooling around with computers, with 3D printers or laser cutters or whatever, there's a sort of a very fun movement for people who want to do things themselves when it comes to kind of anything. And it's a horribly defined thing, but there's maker fairs all over the world.
Right, I remember President Obama hosted one at the White House, but that was mostly for people who brought in things that they had made themselves, right?
Yeah, it was almost like a science fair when they ran the Nation of Makers.
So you're talking about virtual making or physical making.
So specifically at Google, we've got a great number of makers as employees, and we want them to be super happy. And one of the things we found was that the presence of the makerspaces in the various locations led to ease in recruiting, led to an increase in employee happiness, and it allowed them to, it's one of the ways that Google can be a little different.
Right. So you display what they make somewhere, or
it's not actually about celebration of what they make. It's about giving them the tools to make things.
So tell us a cool example of something that you were impressed by that one of the Google makers made.
Well, I mean, it's a very simple thing, but inside one of our data centers, we have a makerspace for the data center employees. I think it was in Pryor, Oklahoma. And one of the data center hardware technicians, his job was basically pulling bad memory and replacing it. Very simple, right? So, they would go to the machine, they would pull the machine out of the rack, they would pull the memory chip, they'd put the memory chip back in, put it back in, turn it back on. And part of the problem with these memory cards is there's a little thing on the bottom. You have to flick down to lift it out. And it's very easy to scuff your fingers when you're doing it. And the last thing you want to do is probably bleed on a server, right? So so this person was thinking about this. And so he went into the makerspace and he designed basically a chip puller. And so it's this little thing that looks like a spoon almost. And you clamp it down on the memory stick and you pull it right out and you don't have to hurt your fingers.
Okay. That's an example.
So little things like that, but then there's bigger things.
Yeah, tell us interesting bigger things.
So we have a camera called the Google Clips, and it's basically an AI-enabled camera. And it was basically prototyped in our makerspace as a 20% project. And so we have this happening actually quite a bit where, a product will have some of its brainstorming or some of it's, not UI, but, physical industrial design, they'll prototype it first in a makerspace or in one of our shops, because we have full machine shops and everything.
Wow.
And so our goal is just basically to make sure those makerspaces are working, that people are cleared to use them with some of the more dangerous tools, that there's training available for. So if you want to learn how to weld, or if you want to learn how to use a lathe, metal lathe, or even woodworking stuff. And so we just make sure that the consumables are replaced.
Right,
it's almost a janitorial job. Actually, a lot of my jobs are janitorial in nature, whether it's making sure source code is clean and well taken care of, or it's, a makerspace is being used properly and safely.
Okay, great. Well, so tell us about your path to getting to Google. I don't think you follow the traditional study at Stanford and go straight to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Right. It was a bit of a sideways movement here and there, and then forward and fits and starts. Right. I mean, was it?
Yeah. So
where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Las Vegas, and I moved to Northern Virginia, D.C. area when I was like 5 or 6.
Because
and then
your parents were.
Yeah, my dad was. My sisters were born in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I was born in Las Vegas, and the only thing those two places have in common are nuclear weapons. And so my dad worked at Oak Ridge, and then he worked at the test site.
Got it.
And then he went to Northern Virginia, and he worked for, I think we worked for the Department of Energy at that point. And then when Reagan came into office, my dad at that point was specializing in geothermal power. And Reagan wasn't a fan of renewables. So one of the first things Reagan did when he moved into the White House is they removed all the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put in place. He just took them off. He's like, I don't need this stuff on the top of my White House. And so all the people...
bothered him, the reflection bothered him or something, huh?
I don't know. It was, you have to remember that this was not long after the oil crisis and some very awkward negotiations with the Middle East. And we were still very much a net importer of oil in the United States. So so my dad, he saw the writing on the wall. So he's like, I'm out. And he took a job in Utah doing drilling core engineering, where you look at the big columns of rock you pull out of the ground and decide how best to drill or how best to, get oil out. So we lived in Utah for a while. Then we moved back to Northern Virginia, where we went to go work for defense contractor BDM and then Thermal Electron. And at that point, I had gotten through most of college, and I had left D.C. because I had been working at the State Department in D.C., and then I worked at a law firm doing basically
without a college degree.
Well, so yeah, I was going to college at the same time, and I was working at a nightclub at the same time. So,
what were you doing at a nightclub? Were you a bouncer or something?
I did do bouncing a little bit, but I was the shortest bouncer. So I'm only 6 feet tall, which is a funny thing to say, but all the other bouncers were like 6'7", and just like ex-football players, ex-cops, or current cops who were making some extra money. And it was just, you don't hire me to be a bouncer, I guess is what I'm saying. Although I didn't get beat up. So I have that going for me. I have funny stories from my time. No, I worked running part of the light show in the club.
But why did you not finish college right away? I guess that's the question.
So I was going to, I wasn't a great scholar, especially as a high school student. So I'd gone directly into community college, and then I went into George Mason, which is a state school. And it had to take me because I graduated from community college. So that was my scholarly career. And I had one course left to take, and I was given an offer to interview and then an offer for a job to work at Tandem Computers in the Silicon Valley in Sunnyvale. Literally it's like under the parking garage for the Apple campus now is where my office was.
But you at that point knew how to code, or what were you doing back then?
Well, no, I was
pre-coding.
coding. No, I was coding. I've been coding since I was 12.
Okay.
But when I was at the State Department, I coded like prototype applications for the Information Management Bureau. And then when I was at a law firm, I was running their email network and some other network services. So
you're an IT guy, basically.
I was an IT guy. And to give you an idea of one of the reasons why I wanted to leave DC so eagerly that I didn't even finish my degree when I left, that I wouldn't finish for 10 years, is the law firm I worked for, they didn't really value the computer support people. And to give you an idea, you would pull up to this, it was in the Warner Building in Washington, D.C., and you would go into the garage, you go to the bottom of the garage, past all the nice cars, the not so nice cars, the bottom. And then you would get out of your car, and then you would go downstairs. And because they
that's
converted,
where you were.
And that's where all the IT and accounting and copy people
Maybe they just were trying to conform to the stereotype that everyone has about tech guys.
Yeah, being in the basement. Yeah.
Possible. So you said, okay, I'm not going to finish university now. This is a great work opportunity.
Well, I had an opportunity.
Yeah, great work opportunity. I want to go check it out. And then what happened? How long did you stay at that company?
I was at Tandem for about 2.5 years. And it was a really fun job. I worked as a tester for a while, like messing with the machines, because they were a fault-tolerant computer maker. And so, like, my job was literally trying to break computers, pulling hard drives out in the middle of transactions, that kind of thing. And then I ended up working on their certificate authority team in computer security because I had training as a cryptographer when I was at the State Department. So, yeah.
Interesting. So then when did you get to Google? How much after that?
It was about 6 months after I left Tandem. So I was in love with Linux already at this point. Linux had come out in 1994. I had discovered it in 96, 95. And I was just an enthusiastic user. And then I ran the Linux users group there. And so I was basically making more money as a consultant on the side of Tandem than I was making at Tandem. And so I decided to leave Tandem. And I was just concentrating on just helping people use Linux. I was helping at the time, I think it was the Gap and like a couple of other, SUSE, which is a Linux distribution. I was helping them on their first website in the United States. And then VA Linux, which was a hardware operation that shipped Linux machines. They're like, hey, would you want to come work for us? I'm like, yeah, sure. I could do this full time? No way, And so I stopped doing those contracts and I jumped into VA Linux. And that's right when Slashdot was starting and these open source focused websites. And Slashdot in a lot of ways was really interesting because it was like a prototype for every discussion you have about user generated content, user moderation, abuse of a site.
Right.
I mean, it's fascinating. You should, in fact, I think you were at one of the early your uncle's, Eric von Hippel's lab on user innovation. When we would have the Slashdot guys come in and talk about that.
So this is how I met Chris. My uncle Eric is a professor at MIT and he runs Innovation Lab, one of the many labs at MIT. So then Google found you somehow and
so 4 years later,
pulled you in.
I left there. I ran a game company for 18 months. And then Google came to me and they're like, listen, we need to hire somebody to look after our open source software efforts. And they keep on saying that you're the person. Do you know anyone like you looking for a job? And I was like, I just shut down the game company after 18 months of not great work, to be frank. And we failed. And so I was like, well, I'm looking for a job. They're like, oh, you're looking, that's great. And so I went in and I had already had offers from a couple of other firms to go work for them. And so I said to Google the smartest thing I ever said in a job hunt, which is, I've already got offers from another couple companies, so we have to move fast. And it turns out that was the smartest thing I ever did.
Okay, note to listeners, sentence. This is a good way to get a job you want.
Yeah, well, have other offers, right?
Right.
And so I had...
And they believed you.
Well, it was true. I wasn't lying.
Right, but you could lie about it and they might not believe you.
Don't lie. It's such a bad practice. And honestly, it's so easy to interview for technology jobs now. You don't need a lie.
Right.
If you have even a modicum of talent, you can get some offers. Yeah, so I interviewed over the next week and a half, 13 different times,
yeah,
13
Google
people.
Is notorious
Back then,
about that, right?
We were notorious. Nowadays, we never go over like 5. But but I interviewed with 13 people. It was about half engineering interviews. What's a hash table? I'm like, seriously?
They didn't ask you how you felt about free food or free laundry or anything?
Oh, no. So one of the things we did back then is when people would interview, we would then host them for lunch. And we would have someone take them to lunch. And you're like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? This is crazy. At the time especially, I think I interviewed on a Friday, and we would have Seafood Fridays, and they would have this incredible spread. I'm talking like 30 feet long of like shellfish and oysters and shrimp. And I'm like, what is going on here? This is crazy.
Yeah.
And it makes everyone want to do well in their interviews too, at least back then. And I did this 2 sets of interviews, and then I was taken to hiring committee, and I actually heard what happened in my hiring committee, which is very unusual.
How did you find out?
I don't want to say in public.
Can't release it.
I'll tell you later over a beer at the pub. So I found out basically during my hiring committee, they'd actually been looking to fill the spot for a little over a year, and they were having a really hard time finding somebody who could pass both the engineering side interviews and the non-engineering interviews with like the marketers and the legal folks. And they're like, well, we've been interviewing this for a year. We have got to fill this. Larry and Sergey really want it filled. He looks like the best candidate we've seen so far, but probably my engineering was not as high as they would have liked for a software engineer at the time. And our standards were extremely high at the time. So they're like, well, let's Google him. So they Google me in the meeting, and the way that it was put, and I'll try to say it in a way that's tolerable for our younger listeners, he doesn't look like a total, epithet. And so let's hire him. If he's terrible, we can just, make him a sweep.
That's a good policy.
Yeah.
Maybe we should adopt that at RUSI. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, just Google people, and say, not too bad. Or
bad,
Snapchat,
right.
whatever people do nowadays.
So you started working at Google, and then did you finish your degree at night?
Okay, so here's what happened. I was in a meeting. I was called into a meeting because we do this thing at the end of the year where we talk about the trends in search, and it's sort of like a celebration, right? And so they brought me into this. They're like, listen, you know a lot about software engineering, and you can talk to marketers without falling on your face. So come into this meeting. I'm like, all right. And I had to meet some what are now very close friends. And one of the people who was in there was Peter Norvig. And Peter Norvig is, one of the great things about Google is you can meet your heroes and work with them. And Peter Norvig was sort of one of them. So the one class I had left was artificial intelligence. And the index book that everyone uses is Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. And AIMA. They just write it. They don't even bother with the whole words when they talk about this book. It's by Russell and Norvig. And so Peter Norvig's in this meeting. I'm like, I'm in a meeting with Peter Norvig. Oh my gosh. And they're going around the room, they're talking, and they're asking my weighty opinion on some stuff. And I was like, Peter Norvig asked my opinion about anything. It's like, can I just wash your car or take your cleaning or whatever? And I left the meeting and I was like, you know what? I should probably take the class. I'm here. At the time, I felt like I was the least educated person in the company because you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting 14 PhDs and a master's student, mostly from Stanford. And so I got my degree. I called up George Mason. I was like, hey, could I take this remotely? They're like, yeah, if your teacher lets you. And I'm like, okay. So I took it. I would literally dial in to the classes, and I would do the homework remotely. And then if they were tests, he would send me the tests at the beginning of the test like everybody else. And then I would have to turn it in before the end of the test like everybody else. And I got an A, and it was frankly my first A in my degree. And then I got my diploma. My mother cried. She was so happy. And then I was at a meeting at the Carnegie Mellon installation in Silicon Valley. And they're like, well, Dr. DiBona. I'm like, I'm not a doctor. And they're like, master? And I'm like, no. They're like, well, you should get your master's here. It was the second year they had been offering a master's program on the Ames campus of CMU. And I was like, I don't know. I'm not a very good student, And they're like, what are you talking about? You got this A. And I'm like, yeah, but I haven't taken a GRE for, I kid you not, like 12 years. And they're like, oh, we don't require it. I'm like, but why would you accept me? And they're like, we'll accept you. Just apply.
Sign up.
And I was like, okay, fine. And then 2 years later, I had a degree and a master's degree in software engineering.
Okay, well, that's interesting. It's good to know for people out there who want to work at companies like Google that there are lots of pathways to get.
Well, there are. And the thing is, there's a lot of people, college right after high school doesn't always work out.
Right.
If you look at the dropout rates in a modern institution, it's very interesting.
So let's talk a bit about some of the challenges that people have out there with tech in general, because I know you have some interesting perspectives on this. So, for example, one is about our personal information being out there, and youngsters will put everything up on all these websites. Older people are more nervous, but the reality is all of our stuff is out there anyway. You put your credit card in to buy something, you have your date of birth somewhere, you have your passport information somewhere.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about how concerned we should be about our personal information being just taken by people, robbed, or whatever it is.
So it's funny because I think of the websites that have my date of birth or have my passport. Like I'm thinking like United probably has those things. Don't target United Airlines listeners.
Yeah.
But the kinds of things that I'm careful about. So when I was at the State Department, I ran a newsletter called the Profiles of Global Terrorism, or Terrorist Profiles Weekly. It has catchier name. And I would release information about terrorist groups and the perspective of a terrorist group over the years, right? So, what was Al-Fatah or whatever. I would say, here's how we felt about them in 1977, and here's how we feel about them now from the government's perspective. And I was just using public domain sources from the State Department to put this together. And so I started getting death threats about 4 weeks into it. And so I went to diplomatic security. I'm like, hey, so I'm getting these death threats. And they're like, well, wait, so they're emailing you death threats? I'm like, yeah. They're like, oh, don't worry about the people who are emailing you death threats. Worry about the people who aren't. And I'm like, wait, what does that mean? And I'm like a kid. I'm like, what have I got myself into? Right. And so they gave me some very basic guidance on the kind of information you release and the kind you don't. And that served me well for a very long time.
So what are the top tips?
I've never actually put the name of my wife on, except for maybe once or twice on blogs and Twitter and the rest. I never share location data.
On your phone, in other words, you turn it off, you disable the location.
I disable location data for social media. So like photos never have GPS coordinates. You can find my home address just because of the public roles and everything. But, like my kids, the only time I've put names or pictures of my children up is the second they're born and say, look, baby, and that's it. And then as my daughter's gotten older, she's 17 now, she is pretty active on Snapchat and, some of the other completely interactable social media things. Instagram is a very popular one with her generation. So we've just talked about sort of the rules are, never take your clothes off in front of a CCD, a camera,
right.
Even one that you think is safe, like on your laptop or something, just don't do it. Never put home information, never put, information about your brother or your parents, or yourself, really.
And she's good about that. She recognizes
Oh, no, she's very savvy.
Does she tell her friends not to do that as well?
The thing is, high school students don't always listen.
Yeah, surprise.
And so what most high school students do nowadays is they'll have the accounts they let their parents follow, and then they'll have the accounts for their friends and them.
Right.
This is actually why Snapchat is so popular, frankly, is it allows students to retain a sense of privacy and sharing just what they want with the people they want to. And Instagram is more for the sort of spread it around information, pictures that are not as personal, frankly, or are more self-aggrandizing. I don't know.
Right. So. I mean, it's interesting because we started out talking about open source versus proprietary information at work, and it's similar rules apply for your personal information. You reveal some things, but not other things, right?
Yeah, there's juxtaposition there that's probably worth exploring in depth. But
in terms of everything, I mean, how concerned are you about just people being able to access so much information, because there is so much information out there, even for those of us who are careful. Yeah,
so I don't know if you've ever visited, or your listeners have ever visited Have I Been Pwned? Just Google for it so you go to the right URL. And you can put in your name or your username, and it'll show you all the places that have had breaches of their security and which ones of your passwords have already been put out there. It's very revealing. So my policy has just always been, don't put anything online that you think is going to be shared, or is going to be breached or whatever.
But your credit card information is online.
Shop. I've actually gone through a lot of credit cards. So, and I don't lose my wallet. I've only lost my wallet like once in the last 25 years. But I've had my credit card stolen, usually in vacation spots like Hawaii or Florida, frankly. I had it stolen probably 6 times, various credit cards. And all I do is I call up the credit card company and I say, okay, or they'll call me first and say, are you in a Target in Honolulu?
You buying 2 bikes? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say, nope. Or there was a hi-fi store in Britain when I hadn't been in London for years at this point. And I was like, nope, I'm not at a Tesco in Yorkshire or wherever. And they just cancel it. And the reality is, when you have a little more wherewithal, it's so much easier to withstand these kinds of attacks. Because
because there's other people that are really sloppy, and so they go for the low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah, and there's the whole, I would just tell people, freeze your credit. You don't need your credit to be scanned by every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Freeze your credit. There's something you can do with the IRS in the United States where it makes it a little more difficult to access your information. Get a good job You save some money because when it's very freeing to say, wow, that charge doesn't look right. So I'm just going to tell the company to bounce it back, and that saves a lot of trouble.
Okay. Well, let's talk about governance.
And never use a debit card. You use credit cards.
All right. Well, we do that all the time in this country.
Yeah.
But let's talk a bit about governance of cyberspace.
Yes.
Cyber. Yes. Well, there are obviously countries that are very open about the internet and let most websites be accessed. And then there are other countries, Iran, Russia, China, Syria, where it's very hard to get onto a number of websites, right?
Yeah.
Where they are really closed down.
Yeah.
Many people in the UK and the US and elsewhere would like some sort of rules about governing cyberspace. It may or may not be possible. What are your thoughts on that? And you do Project Shield at Google, right? And that's all about...
Google has a bunch of little efforts around
Tell us what
protecting
that is.
journalists. So Project Shield is about protecting journalists. I believe that's Project Shield. That's the VPN one, right? Yeah.
Protect news sites and free expression from DDoS attacks.
Oh, that's the DDoS one. Yeah. So there's Project Shield, and there's another one that basically provides VPNs.
uProxy is the other one.
Yeah, uProxy, where people can provide their own VPNs, basically. But to backtrack, so one of the problems that we found was that this actually happened in Azerbaijan to a couple of news outlets, that they would come under these distributed denial of service attacks, which are very cheap to buy in the dark web, And so people would find their websites taken down. And so we wanted to provide help. So we have basically a system whereby the DDoS ends up going at Google, frankly, and we mitigate it and then pass the legitimate traffic to the website. So, and it's the kind of thing that it's sort of, as the traffic levels go up, it switches over DNS to what looks like a content delivery network, and it protects the site from the worst of it. Because we're used to being attacked. Google gets attacked all the time.
So tell me how this works. If you're a Chinese journalist
So it's funny. It's not really Chinese journalists that we see. So China is a different country than Iran or some of the stands or Azerbaijan.
Okay, so you're an Iranian journalist. What happens to you?
So you're an Iranian journalist. Usually what happens to Iranian journalists or people who are covering Iran is that they don't have a problem with their websites because they're not allowed to have them. So they'll commit to websites that are outside the country. And so they're more concerned with getting past the firewalls and the content-sensitive monitoring of their country. And so they'll use VPNs, they'll use things like Tor, and Tor is a sort of anonymizing proxy. It's hard to explain without getting too deep. And they'll try to post their content on sites outside of Iran. And then they'll be targeted by the Iranian government. And that's not great. So Shield's not really great for them because it's more about protecting the sites.
Right.
For them, they would want to look into the VPN efforts and the rest.
So I guess there are a range of ways that countries try to clamp down, right? You can't even access the site, or you try to shut down the site, and so Google tries to help provide alternative ways to access information.
We're specifically concerned with protecting news sites for news organizations and journalists who are trying to commit stories to them. Right. So we've worked with everyone from The Guardian to the New York Times to the Financial Times to and I'm sure you can find all of this on the Project Shield site to try to help them. And I think that's been moderately successful. It's actually a very thorny problem because when you start talking about like China and when you start talking about Russia, right, there are very real consequences if you use some of these technologies inside the country. Right. And so as a human being, do you tell someone, hey, you should use this VPN if it's going to put a target on their back? Right. I mean, because we've heard stories about dissidents in China and very much in Iran being visited by the government after they use these tools. And they're like, how did you know? And it's like, well, we know you're using the tool. We can't necessarily tell what you're doing with it, but we know you're using it.
So what are your views then on the governance of cyberspace? Do you think that, are you of the school that we should just let everything be open and we will never be able to have rules that all countries follow? So, I'm of like four minds on this. So the
civil libertarian to me is like, we should let DNS be federated across every organization. Maybe it should be owned by the UN or something. But I admit that sometimes the influence of some of these more despotic regimes, more controlling regimes, the control they have over some of the international organizations would make me worry about how healthy they would be ongoing. And I worry about, the United States not being a very good minister for the internet, as it were. So I guess I just don't know. It's
I don't think
funny.
anybody knows, and that's why there are a lot of conversations about this.
So one of the big problems we have, so these distributed denial of service attacks, these attacks from nation states and from just criminal organizations against people all over the world through the network, right? It's incredibly hard to police, right? It's incredibly hard for law enforcement officials and the rest to mitigate an attack from another country or even another nation state that may not exist anymore, is in the middle of conflict or whatever, and in places where criminality is flourishing because there are not the structures of society in place. So then you ask yourself, wait a second, so if you can't police it, why are we bothering, Shouldn't we be worrying more about protecting the individual servers and the individual accounts on these servers? And I think that's actually a fine reaction because you can always be more secure in how you handle data and how you handle user flow. And one of the things that I've been really proud that Google's been pushing on is making sure that there's secure sockets layer protection for every website. Otherwise, we tell you in Chrome, like, this is a potentially insecure place. So HTTPS, basically everywhere. It's called HTTPS Everywhere, I think, is the effort. And between Let's Encrypt, which is a great system that provides free certificates that are trusted all the way to the certificate authority for any website, there's no reason to have an insecure website anymore.
Yeah.
And so that basically says to the users that communications between you and the website are protected. Anyone in between cannot change or modify or monitor those. All they see is just gibberish unless they have the key, and that key is between you and the website.
So the concerns people have on cyber attacks, in a sense, is maybe it's trying to get to computer systems rather than through websites, right? So through phishing emails and other ways.
Oh yeah, like the Podesta hack and that sort of thing.
So you're if you have a safe website, or Google tries to ensure a safe websites, it's harder to get in that way, but people get in through other doors.
Yeah, so they'll phish people, they'll catfish people, they'll break into their homes. So the question is, most people don't worry about nation state level attacks, right? So they worry about opening a bad attachment and then having to rebuild their computer.
Because a criminal will get in and get your bank information, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, they'll install adware, they'll install malware that looks for credit card information or whatever. Or they'll use your computer as a zombie computer for a botnet, so that you don't even know it. You're just using your computer, but you're also one of the distributed denial of service attackers on the internet. You don't even know it, right? So there's a lot of reasons to hack a person's personal computer, but what nation states are after and what the larger criminal organizations are after are these large databases of user information, whether it's account information, personal information. And in the case of nation states, they're looking for very specific things sometimes, whether it's in the case of, the Clinton and Podesta hacks, they want to embarrass.
Right.
They want to change the political.
Well, that's the Russian behavior. It's interesting if you contrast Russia attempts or Russia hacking versus China. It seems that China wants to hoover things up, but we don't know what they want to do with it. If you remember, China hacked one of the U.S. government websites where 10 million people like myself, actually, all of our long, OPM.
OPM,
yeah,
that's
and
right. So if you'd ever been a federal employee, your information was there.
So, and my 87-page security clearance documents, et cetera.
Right. The SS,
but we don't know,
or whatever it's saying. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I can't remember either anymore. But in other words, with China, they just hoovered it all up. They didn't spit it out there. They didn't seem to spit it out there, whereas the Russians seem to want people to know, and they want to spit it out there and want to embarrass people, right? There are seems to be different behaviors.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm in a weird position with China. I actually really like going to China. I think it's a really neat country, and not everyone loves China. But it seems to me what the Chinese really care about is, I mean, yes, they care about the Taiwan Straits and the rest, and they care about China's place in the world. But when they're looking at computer security, and it's been my experience that the Chinese really care to know who knows who and why, right? So, I mean, it's no secret that China is extremely sensitive about Falun Gong and those sorts of groups inside the country because they see it as a threat to internal security. So it's been my impression when they monitor, when they collect information, which is a nice charitable way of saying it, that they're doing it because they want to see who's gathering and why.
Whereas the Russians are stir things up and cause conflict.
I mean,
disrupt. Really, they like to disrupt. It seems, the Russians.
I mean, I couldn't possibly figure out the motives of a government like China or like Russia or even Iran, but it's a very, I watch what these countries are doing, and sometimes I don't understand the motivation.
Right. But that kind of leads us into concerns many have about cyber conflicts in the future. And so, one country shuts down the electricity grid, or you shut down, I don't know. I mean, there was just the city, right? In this country, you shut down the banking system, so no one can get. So it seems that concerns about those types of conflicts are obviously the governments and militaries are planning for how to respond to those types of conflicts. But how worried are you in the tech world about those types of conflicts? And how much worse would they be than a traditional war with tanks and soldiers?
So a tank and a soldier is always going to do quite a bit more damage than someone with a keyboard, most of the time. So this is really more of a question for the infrastructure of a country, right? So how much is that infrastructure dependent on computer communications that are accessible to the outside world? So it's funny. So everyone who talks about this eventually gets back to the Stuxnet virus. And what that was, and I'm not going to comment on who I think did it. I'm sure there's been plenty of people who are happy to do that. But what it was basically malware that existed on USB keys that were brought into an air-gapped network. And it was designed to attack certain industrial controls that were present in basically a plutonium enrichment facility in Iran. And it basically introduced modulation in the centrifuges that eventually destroyed them, right? And these are, in some ways, very delicate scientific instruments. So when they did this, they set the program back some time. And it was considered this wildly successful attack on the nuclear infrastructure of a country. And that probably gave people more pause, because people have been saying in the computer security world, listen, you think you're air-gapped. You think that there's no way to go from someone's compromised internet account to your internal secured systems. But what we found is that people are always, for the ease of use, they'll have a computer that has access to both networks. They'll take data from one network to the other. They'll take executable files from one network to the other. And so it's chunkier. It's not as efficient, but it's not safe. So you really have to look at any internal network, any network, really, any network machine, computer, phone, and think, can I trust everyone else on this network? And how does that change your behavior if you can't, right? And what you come to very quickly is, so within companies, there is this idea that once they're behind the firewall, they're safe. And then in some companies, the defense contractors and the rest, they've never been safe, because there are people who work for their company who aren't actually just working for their company, or they're going to liberate documentation.
Right.
Yeah. And so you have to actually take a look at the kind of information inside a company and say, what is actually truly precious and we have to protect, and what isn't. And we can give access to everybody, or even people outside the company. And now we roll all the way back to the open source answer.
But how far away are we from a massive cyber attack that could really literally shut down? You couldn't get money out of your bank. You couldn't turn the water tap on. You couldn't open your garage door. All sorts of things that could happen in a country. I mean, in a sense, Estonia had that happen to them, didn't they, in the early 2000s? And now they are fully online. Every Estonian citizen does everything online.
Yep.
So instead of going much more traditional, they actually double down and they try to make their system much more secure. They claim it is. It's hard to know how secure it really is, but how far away are we from that kind of massive cyber conflict?
So maybe I have a rosy view of the future. I don't think we will have that level of attack absent tanks and planes and bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So
it'd be joint, some sort of hybrid.
It would absolutely be more of a hybrid threat. And I would hope that the armed services would be ready for that kind of thing, ready to fall back to more traditional communications, radio and the rest. But yeah, I mean, I can't picture that actually happening absent the rest. So maybe you would look at like the Russian attacks in the Crimea, right? You say, okay, what was the cyber component of that?
A lot of it was misinformation, and
it was largely around propaganda and misinformation, and using the public networks to muddy the waters, especially around the MH17, missile attack.
But they did also shut down some infrastructure as well. I think that, No, it's a good example of that. So then, are you more worried about criminals? Are you more worried about that 400-pound guy in the basement that Donald Trump talked about? You're more worried about election systems being vulnerable, for example? I mean, I think in the United States they're very vulnerable, aren't they?
I think that the electronic infrastructure on voting in the United States is really in bad shape. And I really, honestly, I would just revert to paper until we can actually...
My nephew is good at this kind of hacking, and he's been able to hack into several election machines with a group of kids. They did it on purpose to show people how easy it was. So you think criminals right now are still our biggest threat in the cyberspace?
So when you talk about elections, you're talking about nation-state influences, and I think that's a very big problem, and one that we are just fooling ourselves with.
Yeah, lots of threats, basically.
There's a ton of threats.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like personal matters, like your garage door, right?
Yeah.
So I worry more about just a common, robber wanting to steal stuff out of my garage or something than I would about China or Russia or some foreign threat deciding to flood my house by making the sewers not work. I mean, it's like it's kind of a long distance. I mean, I want my home to be secure. I want my city, I want my town, I want my country to be secure from foreign threats and from attackers. Of course. But while it's really fun in novels and movies, it's just not, computer security isn't magical. Computer capabilities aren't magical. You can't hit a button and shut off a water treatment plant. The microbes aren't going to pay attention to you. So you need the breakdown of society for some of these attacks to really work. And the thing is, I don't really care about a brownout or an outage. I mean, those actually happen because people have too many Teslas in Palo Alto. And I'm actually not kidding about that.
That's
that
funny.
actually happened.
Yeah, that is funny.
Yeah, there were overnight brownouts. So you never get brownouts overnight. It's always during the day when people are actually using electricity.
Right.
But inside the Crescent Park neighborhood of Palo Alto, they had too many Teslas.
Because everyone's plugging in their cars.
Yeah, they were. And so they had to upgrade the transformer infrastructure for the city. It was stupid, honestly.
That's funny. So that kind of gets us into AI and cyber. So artificial intelligence and I guess not really robots. It would be autonomous vehicles, autonomous tanks, autonomous toasters. But robots or using AI. How easy is it to hack autonomous anything?
So, boy, that's a huge question. Do you mean how easy is it to hack into an airplane's autopilot or a car's distance following cruise control or lane keeping system? Or does that mean how do you bias an AI from its initial data set so it thinks some people are bad and some people are good? For these like police AIs that they're using. So, I mean, it's actually a huge question, right? And when I hear about autonomous vehicles and the rest, I worry more about software being released before it's ready, and basically alpha testing in the public. I think that's very dangerous, and I think that there's been some there's no nice way of putting this. If you watch the Uber video where they hit that poor woman in Arizona, they're like, oh, it's really dark. And it's like, yeah, it had a LiDAR. It was bright as day. It was clear. There was no reason for that woman to have died. And it's funny because Volvo, who made the car that they built the platform on, they had actually specifically shut off the Volvo's detection system. And the Volvo's detection system was going crazy. It was like, brake, brake, brake. That was the signal that was coming from the Volvo one, which they couldn't shut off. They just had broken the connection between the Volvo system and the Uber system. And so the Volvo system was going nuts. It was like trying to stop the car.
Wow.
And the Uber one was just ignoring him.
Because it was just not ready. They put it out too early.
They put it out too early, in my opinion. Now and the security driver was not paying attention.
Right.
And
now you said, though, speaking of not paying attention, didn't you say yourself you fell asleep in an autonomous vehicle once?
Yeah. So during the early days of testing on 280, I was in the back seat of
you were
a
not
Prius.
the security driver.
Not the security driver. The security driver was totally awake, and there was a programmer in the passenger seat, and they let me ride in the back with a couple of friends. And you have to realize that these cars, and this was 2007, 2008, I want to say it was very early. The air conditioning could rarely keep up with the computation going on in the car. So it was warm, and we had just had our second child. Yeah. And so it was still that.
Sleep deprived.
I was sleep deprived. And so I'm like, they're like, we want to take you for a ride. And I was really excited to do it. And so it went autonomous from our campus in Mountain View. And we were about midway up 280 on the way to San Francisco, it was a pretty far drive. And I was out.
That's funny. That would have been a great video. Chris asleep in the back of an autonomous vehicle.
Well, no, it's funny because they were excited. They're like, yeah, I can't believe you trusted us enough to fall asleep. And I'm like,
that's great. Now we're coming to the end of our podcast. I would like to ask people what kind of advice you would give to youngsters looking for a job in whether it's the tech world or what's the best advice you ever had, or what kind of advice could you offer for youngsters who are thinking about their career and where they want to go?
It's funny. It's sort of a better time than ever to start developing software, to program. There's so many great resources that, people of my generation just simply didn't have. Whether it's
our
YouTube,
generation.
Well, I'm 46, just for for people to know.
Our generation, I repeat, but anyway.
Yeah.
So what's your advice for
my
youngsters
advice
today?
is they should ask themselves what they want to do, right? It's like, and just what they want to program today, and say, okay, I would like to write something that does X, Y, or Z as a program, just a small thing, and just go do it. Go on to Khan Academy, go onto YouTube, watch some videos, download some tools. They're all free, and see if you like it. Because computer literacy is different from learning to program. It's different from working in a tech company, right? I mean, there's plenty of jobs in a company, whether it's Google or whatever, that are actually not programming. And there's like a spectrum of your technical knowledge. So just figure out what you really want, right? Because I can tell you, if you're the best at something, whether it's sales or accounting or programming, there's a job for you in these tech companies, because they need really good people, really smart people, really talented people to deal with just the everyday problems that a company represents.
I mean, when you were 19, 20, you never would have thought you'd end up where you are now, right?
No, I mean, when I was 19 or 20, I guess I had just gotten my security clearance, but I was still working in retail. I was working the service desk of the Circuit City, and I was working with Walden Books in D.C.
So lots of changes. And I think the younger generation should be prepared, as they say, for many careers, actually. Unlike when we were young, you thought about what you wanted to do, and it felt like you had to make one choice, and you were stuck with it no matter what you did. Now people are changing careers, are changing in many ways, right? Well, Chris, it's been really wonderful chatting with you. We're really grateful for your support of us at RUSI as well, sitting on our advisory board and advising our cyber program, and really happy to have had you come in and inaugurate our RUSI podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Our next podcast will be with Baroness Ashton, who was best known as the first foreign minister for the European Union, and we're looking forward to that conversation.
This podcast was produced by Tom Ascott, developed by Caroline Tranter, with further research from Neil Watling. Keep up to date with the latest defense and security analysis by visiting www.rusi.org.